Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by thanking Paul and Mary Gottfried for their great generosity in inviting me to cross the Atlantic to be with you this evening, and to thank them for the great confidence they have placed in me that I shall make sense in my speech to you this evening, and that I shall not be too grossly offensive of your sensibilities while giving it. Now, I have been invited to speak this evening on the subject of the European right. And when Paul invited me to speak on this subject a few months ago, it seemed a very good idea to do. The European right, that rather mixed group of often mutually loathing movements across the European continent, had done very well in the European elections, and I think my job was to come along here and try to sound cheerful. After all, you are living in year 5 of what you doubtless call the Obama tyranny, and if I could be brought across the Atlantic to tell you about something clean and brave that was taking shape in the great European motherland, then it would surely be worth the great trouble of bringing me here this evening. Well, that was then, and this is now. And since there is at least one person in this room who was there, and since I really believe that everyone in this room has read about it, I do not need to go into detail about what happened early this month in Budapest. No, I'd rather not. But what I will say is that of all the countries in which Richard Spencer might have organised his conference, Hungary did seem by far the most friendly. After all, its government has been widely denounced as semi-fascist, and the party that was closely associated with the conference for a while was widely regarded as fascist without any qualification whatever. Yet that government banned the conference, and that party distanced itself from the conference without a moment's hesitation. Or I could mention Mr. Putin's Russia, which many people regard as the last bastion of traditionalist Christian civilization. Well, you know, for the past quarter millennium, Western intellectuals, conservatives and anti-conservatives, have been taking turns to fall in love with Russia. First of all, it was people like Diderot who thought that Russia was the home of enlightened despotism until he got there and found that it was the home of despotism only. Then there was de Maistre, who greatly admired Russia from a distance, but really couldn't put up with the persecutions of Western Christianity and even the deadly facts of serfdom. Then there were the honest leftists in the 20th century who eventually got sick of denying and then trying to defend industrial mass murder. Now, more recently, it's the turn of the conservatives to fall in love with Russia again, but the fact that Alexander Dugin was prevented from leaving Russia to attend Richard Spencer's conference, and the fact that the Russian authorities joined in the ritualistic denunciations of the National Policy Institute shows that Russia may not be all that people in the conservative movement hope or believe it to be. Indeed, my suspicion is that although Mr. Putin is a very useful person to have around because he provides a counterweight to the otherwise unchecked lunacy of our own masters, I do not think that Russia is any kind of model for traditionalist conservatism, and it probably has nothing whatever, and never will have anything whatever, to tell those of us who, from whatever point of view we are undoubtedly within the Western political tradition. However, let me turn to my own country, where the UK Independence Party not only won the European elections outright, but has also managed to gain a seat in the House of Commons in the past few weeks, and which may gain another seat in the House of Commons in the next few weeks. Now, I was speaking to someone earlier who dismissed UKIP as a party of soft-core libertarians. I think that's a fair description. And since I regard myself as a hardcore libertarian, I do not think that the description is in the least pejorative. And let's face it, European nationalism, I said, is a mixed group of movements. There are young men in uniforms who like to bring out long quotes by people like Friedrich Nietzsche and Julius Evola, and that may be entirely valid to some European traditions, but I'm an Englishman, and if you believe that different countries have different traditions, I'm afraid you have to accept that the English tradition is the liberal tradition. Mine is a country which is most notably associated with things like freedom of the press, trial by jury, the idea that government should be limited under law. Those are our default traditions. Now, you may or may not like that, but it is undoubtedly our tradition, and that is what UKIP stands for, and UKIP has done very well and is doing well. So good luck to UKIP. But, ladies and gentlemen, a note of caution. I do not believe that UKIP's run of luck will be repeated next year in the general election. Our electoral system is very like yours. Power is got by winning a majority, a simple majority of the votes in a majority of the constituencies. Now, the electoral logic of such a system is that you must vote very often for the people you despise in order to keep out the people you fear. And although I don't need to protest my utter contempt for David Cameron's Conservative Party, I also freely admit that next year I will vote Conservative. I would like to vote UKIP, but you see, I must vote Conservative, otherwise there is a risk that we shall have another Labour government, and I do assure you that Labour, even if only marginally worse, is worse than the Conservatives, and Labour is worth keeping out. And what I say about what I will do next year is what many other people will do. I shall be surprised if UKIP keeps its 1 or 2 members in the new House of Commons, and I shall be astonished if UKIP makes any advance beyond those 1 or 2 people. Now that then is the European right. Now, you may choose to believe that the revolution against the present order of things will begin in Europe, and that you will be able to profit from the example of our exertions here in the United States. But define it as you will. The centre of power in our civilization is inside the United States. And you cannot expect any meaningful change in Europe while America continues to be what it is. I am not a frequent visitor to Hungary. I don't know Hungarian. I have no feel for the country. I also don't know the details of what happened in Budapest earlier this month, but I have no doubt that when the Hungarian government turned nasty and shut down that conference, it was at the prompting of the American government. And there is certainly no doubt that the American government expressed a certain degree of approval after the fact. If Richard Spencer had been organising a conference in Budapest to protest in favour of gay marriage or to demand higher welfare spending for gypsies, and his conference had his conference been shut down, there would have been a very sharp rebuke from the American State Department. In fact, Richard was there to express a number of heretical opinions, and the American State Department said nothing particularly condemnatory of the Hungarian authorities. But as I said, Hungary is a foreign country, I don't know it. What I do know is that at least since 1940, the American government has pulled every string that matters in London. In 1956, the American government stopped a British invasion of Egypt because this action, which the British government perceived to be in the British national interest, was not congruent with the American government's perception of its national interest. We were allowed to go ahead with our war with Argentina in 1982, only following a rather embittered argument within the American ruling class in Washington. I do believe, without going into the details, that the American government has occasionally engaged in acts of murder in my country against dissident politicians, and on one occasion in 2003 against an embarrassing civil servant who might have blown the whistle on the fact that the American and British case for the war with Iraq was, from beginning to end, a pack of lies. Now, I could go through a whole list of cases in which the American government has pulled strings in London. When eventually the archives are opened and we look at the truth, it may be that much of what I believe is false. I may have misapprehended the situation, but I have no doubt that there will be many other scandalous and so far unknown cases where the American government has told the British government exactly what to do on all occasions. Now, what I want, and what my UKIP friends want, is a revolution in my country. We want to stop our servicemen from being sent off to behave like violent fools in places that are none of our business. No more Afghanistans, no more Iraq, certainly no Syrias. You may not clap at this. I believe in legalising all drugs. I believe, and so do my friends, in ending the war on financial privacy under the name of fighting the war on money laundering. We believe in a currency, to some extent, based on gold. We believe that the laws... I and my friends believe that the laws under which my country are governed should be made by men in my country fully accountable to the British people. I believe, and so do my friends, that we should at some point withdraw from the European Union. We also do not subscribe to the lunatic notion that membership of my country is something to be conferred by a piece of paper issued by the British state. And although we're not sure what should be done about the great harm that has taken place over the past 60 years, we do not look favourably on the transformation of large parts of our homeland into foreign enclaves. Now, in short, we want our country back, but I assure you that if a government were ever somehow to come to power in my country committed to even a fraction of that wish list, it would face strong and probably effective opposition from the American government. The American government is not going to give up on its most important satellite in running the New World Order. And so if there were to be a British national reaction, if we were to elect a government that was fully committed to British or English values, it would have to face down a great deal of opposition from the American government. Now, of course, I have carried you with me so far. We can all agree about those wicked feds in Washington or those pernicious neoconservatives. There are people who believe that there are other groups who have subverted American politics and turned the United States into the strong-arm man for the New World Order. Now, where I may perhaps part company from some of you is that I do not believe that anything that the American government has done or may have done in recent years with regard to constructing the New World Order or shutting down conferences like Richard Spencer's is in any sense out of keeping with the American tradition as it has emerged during the past 300 years. I believe that Europe is being smothered not because America has been captured by a sinister minority, but because the self-destruction during the 20th century of every other actual or potential other force which might have opposed it has left America absolutely supreme in the world and free to make the world in its own historic image. Now, the story of America begins in England at the time of the Protestant Reformation. I have said that the English tradition, to a very large extent, is the liberal tradition, and this is undeniably true. It's an undeniable but a partial truth. England is the country where the modern world emerged. It was an Englishman who said, "The poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the richest he." England is a country where devotion to a highly liberal common law was carried to the point where slavery itself could be abolished by a judgment of the civil courts, and where even during the great panic that attended the French Revolution, probable traitors could get off because they had to be brought to trial before a jury which was unconvinced by the case made out to it that these men had committed any offence known to the traditional law of my country. And so, yes, England is most certainly the homeland of the liberal tradition. But liberalism has not had any kind of monopolistic hold on the English mind. There has, since the Protestant Reformation, been one other alternative intellectual force in England, which you could call Puritanism. Now, I use the word Puritan as a shorthand term. A Puritan is someone who does not believe in live and let live. He's not someone who would say with a houseman, "And if my ways are not as theirs, let them mind their own affairs." No, the Puritan is somebody who would have everybody else dance as he desires. A Puritan is someone who believes so strongly in his own rightness and goodness that he is equipped and indeed possesses the moral right to tell everybody else how to live. Indeed, nothing must stand in his way when it comes to remaking the world in his particular image. Laws are there to restrain the wicked. They should be no restraint on the good. Now, the first notable contest in England between the Puritans and the Libertarians, loosely defined, took place in the early 17th century. And this had an obviously religious manifestation. But what I would say is that the religious manifestation of Puritanism, the Calvinism was not central to Puritanism itself. Men did not become Puritans because they were Calvinists. They became Calvinists because they were Puritanism. And in the mental furniture of that particular age, Calvinism was the most appropriate and obvious legitimizing ideology. There was a slight confusion in the early 17th century so far as the Puritans found themselves on the limited government side in a political dispute over the size and scope of the English state. But there is no doubt that in the brief flowering of the Puritan ascendancy that followed the Civil War of the 1640s, England was turned into a very sinister, morally totalitarian state. A country in which Roman Catholics and alleged witches and other minorities were hunted down with grim hysteria, in which adultery became an offence carrying the death penalty, in which the theatres were shut down and Christmas was abolished. The Puritans made England a most unpleasant place. Now, the good news for England is that this ascendancy was very brief, and after 1660 it was just pushed aside, and for the next 200 years England was ruled by a broadly libertarian aristocracy. The bad news for America is that many of the disappointed Puritans made their way across the Atlantic here to build their shining city on a hill. Now, the idea of American exceptionalism is entirely Puritan in its origin, and you can see the continual American tendency to antinomianism. During the war between the states, for example, the northern ruling class treated the South with a complete disregard for justice or even common humanity. And the reason for that was that because the United States was an expression of absolute divine good, anybody who was against it must be absolutely evil and deserved what he got. And you see this with the deviations from the rule of law in the treatment of northern dissidents during that war, the abolition of habeas corpus, the shutting down of opposition newspapers, the locking up of dissidents, the threats issued against judges who wouldn't go along with the government. But even if you look at the common civil politics of the United States in the 19th century, you can see the strong influence of Puritan antinomianism. And of course, by the 19th century, a purely Calvinist, a purely religious justification for this pre-existing Puritanism was going out of fashion, and so it was supplemented by various ideologies of social purity or progressivism. America is the country which eventually banned beer for a while. It is the country where, before it banned beer, it came very close in a number of states to banning cigarettes. America is the only country in the world where, before Bizet's opera Carmen could be performed, the first act was recited from outside a cigarette factory to outside a dairy, because it was considered to be too grossly offensive to portray a cigarette factory on stage, let alone the act of smoking. Now, later in the 20th century, it is American Puritanism which gave us the war on drugs, the war on money laundering, and coming into the present, there is a strong continuity of originating impulse between the censorship of books and theatrical displays and films under the old Puritan dispensation and modern political correctness. Of course, cultural Marxism is, in its surface manifestations, a European movement, indeed a very strongly Jewish movement. Although Gramsci and Althusser and Foucault were not Jewish, Adorno was Jewish, and Marcuse was Jewish, and you can go through a long list of cultural Marxists or of leading lights of cultural Marxism who were Jewish. And equally, many of the more fanatical commissars of political correctness are Jewish. Yet, this does not make political correctness some kind of Jewish takeover of the United States. No. Classical Marxism was no less Jewish than cultural Marxism. Indeed, in its intellectual cohesion, classical Marxism is far superior to cultural Marxism. And yet in both England and America, classical Marxism has had less impact on practical affairs than train spotting or bird watching. If cultural Marxism has become the hegemonic ideology, first of America and then of the West via its cultural satellites, there must be some other reason than the presence of Marxism as the noun and the advocacy of some Jewish intellectuals. And the reason is that the legitimizing... Many conservatives misunderstand what happened in the 1960s. There were actually... The 1960s was a collision of two forces. On the one hand, you have the collapse of the old legitimizing ideologies of Puritanism. God was dead, or God was redefined as love. And on the other side, you had a great advance of sex and drugs and rock and roll. And Puritanism was right out of fashion. Just at this moment, you had the neo-Marxists, the cultural Marxists, coming into their first main flowering, and they were grabbed by the Puritans. That was the new legitimizing ideology. The cultural Marxists themselves believed that racism and sexism were effects of capitalism, and that heaven on earth could be realized by abolishing capitalism. That is the founding fathers of political correctness. Actually existing cultural Marxism believes no such thing. Actually existing cultural Marxism has no problem whatever with business, enterprise, or with profit. The means of production must be controlled, undoubtedly, by the authority. They must be controlled for two reasons. First, because people must be stopped from doing wicked things like smoking, drinking, eating the wrong kind of food, and what have you, wearing fur, destroying the planet, you name it, a long list of reasons. And the second reason is